Welcome. I'm Ron Sooney. I'm emeritus in the History and Political Science departments, and it's my pleasure to moderate this panel of very distinguished philosophers, even though I myself am a historian and political scientist. This major speaker last night, in fact, one of the things I learned, besides a lot about moral and political progress, was how to pronounce her name properly. Leah Ipi. And I'm going to introduce everyone at once, and then we'll go in alphabetical order, and then Leah can answer. And each person is going to speak about 25 minutes. I hope you'll turn off your phones, if that's possible, so that we don't have interruptions. I have to keep mine on, though I've turned the sound down so that I can time them. And then afterwards, we'll open the floor up. There'll be mics at each side, and you can get in line, and we'll recognize them alternately as we go through the day. So first, about Professor Ipi. She is appropriately the Ralph Miliband Professor in Politics and Philosophy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And she's the author of a number of important books: Indignity, A Life Reimagined, Global Justice and Avant-Garde Political Agency, The Meaning of Partisanship with Jonathan White, and The Architectonic of Reason. But the one I like best is her autobiography called Free, Coming of Age at the End of History, about her experience living in Stalinist Albania and the post-Soviet, post-state socialist world. She's won many prizes. We all were privileged to hear her last night, and today she'll be answering the discussants one after the other. I'm going to introduce everyone at once, as I said, and the first speaker is my own colleague in the philosophy department. I'm in history, and she's the John Dewey Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy and Women's Gender Studies at University of Michigan. This is, of course, Elizabeth Anderson. And she's the author of Value in Ethics and Economics, The Imperative of Integration from Princeton University Press, Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives, and Why We Don't Talk About It. And also a book, Hijacked, How Neoliberalism Turned the Work Ethic Against Workers, very much about the Protestant ethic, as I remember, and how workers can take it back. So Liz will go first. She'll be followed by Philip Kitcher, who's also a John Dewey professor, this time of philosophy emeritus at Columbia University and honorary fellow of Christ College, Cambridge. And his philosophical work ranges from the philosophy of mathematics, the philosophy of science, and the philosophy of biology to ethics, political philosophy, philosophy of education, and philosophy of literature and music. Amazing. His 22 books include Science, Truth, and Democracy, The Ethical Project, Moral Progress, the Main Enterprise of the World, Rethinking Education, and The Rich and the Poor. He's the past president of the American Philosophical Association. One could go on and on with each of these introductions. Our third speaker will be Daniel Wodak, is Associate Professor of Philosophy and by courtesy Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania. Daniel works broadly in moral, social, and political and legal philosophy, and most recently, his work is focused on projects on democracy and discrimination. And he's won several important prizes, like the Mark Sanders Prize, and he's currently writing a book on the one person, one vote principle. And he serves as the editor also of Nomos, as one of the book review editors for ethics, and on the editorial board for legal theory. So without any more hesitancy, let's begin with Liz Anderson.
It's a real pleasure to be able to comment on Leah's wonderful lecture, and I thank you for delivering such a brilliant lecture on political progress. I'm going to start with points of agreement before I move to, I think, an important challenge that Leah needs to meet in order to have an effective theory that addresses the crisis of our current moment. But just for backdrop, why are we here at this political moment, given that in 1990 everything looked different? I mean, anyone who was alive in the 90s remembers some critical, momentous events: the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. These countries, by and large, replaced a communist system with democratic systems, at least formally democratic systems. We could look at the fall of military dictatorships across South America and their replacement with democracies. We could look at the end of apartheid and its replacement with a democratic regime. Things were looking great in the 90s, right? We even had political theorists who thought, this is the end of history, right? We've gotten this is it. We've solved the problem, political problem. We've got the right form of political regime. And people will learn that, and they'll stick with it. And democracy will spread. People thought, well, yeah, so next we'll see what's happening in the Arab Spring. Well, Then people start thinking, here you had a wave of protests against authoritarian regimes, and in many of these places, an attempt to replace authoritarianism with democratic regimes, but those fizzled. So by the 2010s, that enormous hope and optimism about the prospects for democracy worldwide were faltering. And since then, what do we see? Even in democracies of long standing, the rise of far-right parties threatening to dismantle the whole system. So that's where we are right now. And not surprisingly, those of us who are still committed to democracy, we need hope in the face of these powerful regressive movements, not least in the United States. And Leah is here to offer it in the form of a theory of political progress, what it is, and how we can know we've achieved it, at least for now. And I agree with her that we need to believe in the possibility of political progress in order to make such progress. Or, as Leah says, following Kant, that the idea of progress is an idea necessary for practical reason, and I agree with that. And indeed, we also have very good grounds for thinking that we've achieved political progress many times in history. My own research on political progress takes as its central case study the abolition of slavery. It's undeniable political progress here of enormous scope, where abolitionist movements started about 300 years ago and swept across the world. So I'd like to first start off then by highlighting some of the many vital insights that Leah's theory of political progress offers her. First, she offers a really important analysis of the relationship of politics to morality. Politics, she says, is a way of further specifying moral norms, rendering them binding, reciprocally justifiable, and entrenched in collective institutions. Well, I just would amend this slightly. That's at least what democratic politics aspires to. But it's important to recognize that other regimes today, even if they don't aspire to that, claim to be doing so. And that reveals some important common ground, even if it's hypocritical. Secondly, Leah argues that political progress requires the ability to learn from history, and I think that's right. But we don't have to think of history in sort of a grand narrative. What I would say, rather, is that politics requires the ability to learn from experience. Every law, policy, and institution is an experiment in living together. And this insight, I think, is the essence of all pragmatist accounts of progress as a kind of learning. How do we learn whether some moral norm, as specified in a particular law or policy or institution, is worth following? Well, you figure this out by living in accordance with that law, policy, or institution, that institutionally embodied moral norm, and see whether it solves the problem we wanted it to solve, and without creating worse and more intractable problems. Okay, well, you learn that in experience. You see what happens when you act in accordance with the norm you think is right, the specified norm, the institutionally specified norm. And if acting in accordance with that doesn't solve the problem we needed it to solve, okay, then we got to go back to the drawing board. Maybe we got our diagnosis of the problem wrong. Maybe we're selecting inept means to solve that problem. Or it might be that it actually makes headway on the problem in question, but it's generating all these side effects that we didn't anticipate, which are problematic. And then, okay, now we have a new set of problems, and we have to investigate. Can we live with the consequences? Maybe the side effects are not that bad, but if they are bad, then we have to see whether we can devise new institutions to address that problem or ameliorate its effects. And then we can see, well, can we live with the remaining negative effects, or is the problem tractable enough that we can make progress on solving this new problem? So, because our collective life is continually facing and generating new problems, we have to establish political institutions that are capable of effectively and continuously serving their problem-solving roles. But any such establishment of a political regime creates two problems of its own. Firstly, the regime needs to demonstrate its own legitimacy. And second, it has to secure its own stability. That's what Leah calls the problem of continuity. Leah rightly sees that the question of the legitimacy of a political regime is deeply tied to its ability to establish and enforce norms of justice, which makes the regime's coercion acceptable to those subject to it. So the picture of political progress envisioned here is one of continuous normative experimentation and refinement. On Leah's vision, which I wholeheartedly endorse, political theory has to work hand in hand with the social sciences to understand the problems that we face, analyze their structure, and contribute tools for designing and evaluating possible solutions. At this stage, I think it's helpful to distinguish two levels of problem solving. So we could consider first-order problem solving as the problems that a political regime is expected to solve. Setting up a transportation infrastructure, making sure that the trash gets taken out, controlling pollution, educating children. The problems go on in modern large-scale states. But Leah is mostly focused on what I'm going to call second-order problem solving, and that has to do with designing the political institutions that are assigned the task of solving all these first-order problems. Leah argues that political regimes suffer from a legitimation crisis when they proved repeatedly unable to solve their first-order problems. At that point, we may experience intractable political conflicts. This is a second-order problem that may lead to a political rupture, revolution, and regime change. That's the kind of problem we're facing now in our current crisis of democracy. Now, Leah offers three criteria for judging whether this process of second-order problem solving amounts to a kind of political progress. However, I want to take issue with the fact that she's expressing this progress in purely theoretical terms. What I want to stress here is that progress has to be achieved in practice in the establishment of new ways of relating to one another through our new political institutions. I don't think Leah disagrees with this, but I think the correct formulation of the criteria of progress has to incorporate that understanding. And furthermore, the progress in question has to be seen and felt in the lived experience of the people governed by those very political institutions. So all I'm going to do here is offer a friendly amendment, reformulating her 3 criteria of progress in terms of political practices and not just better theories of justice. Firstly, the diagnostic criterion. The political movements driving regime change have to articulate an accurate understanding of the sources of political conflict and the normative disputes underlying them, one that is accepted by enough people to bring about that change. The key point here is it's got to be an accurate understanding of what is distressing the people, right? And the people then express their solution to their second-order problem in the form of a better conception of justice as realized in a new form of political regime or constitution. Secondly, the innovating criterion. The new political regime embodies that conception of justice in a form that preserves the normative achievements of the previous regime while avoiding its failures. And third, the heuristic criterion. The new conception of justice in the regime that embodies it is flexible and innovative enough to effectively guide the regime's response to unforeseen problems. I would add that if the political regime fails the heuristic criterion, then it's going to fail to secure its own stability as well as its legitimacy. So with these very modest revisions to Leah's criteria, I'm happy to congratulate her on joining the Pragmatist Club. Welcome. Okay, so now let's step back and consider the challenge with which I open my comments. Our current crisis of democratic backsliding, which is experienced across the world's democracies, amounts to a profound legitimation crisis for democratic regimes. The democracies and those members of the public who still believe in democracy urgently need to mobilize to meet this crisis. And they need to use democratic means in meeting it. Because if they don't use democratic means, their resort to extra-legal or authoritarian force will prove that democracy is not up to the task of rescuing itself, and that would be a big problem for democracy. So, Leah supplies some compelling reasons to hope for progress, but as we all know, hope alone is not enough to solve democracy's legitimation crisis. I agree with her that today's authoritarian political movements are regressive and that we have sufficient grounds to believe this. So as far as diagnosis and solutions go, we can rightly refuse to accept the terms in which supporters of authoritarian movements express their grievances and propose solutions. But here's where I disagree. It's not, agreeing with that is not to say, as Leah says, that we may therefore, quote, exclude from normative attention some movements and groups, typically only those that endorse views that we now find uncontroversially flawed. I have 2 problems with that, at least that idea as expressed. Firstly, excluding the members of these movements from normative attention would be self-defeating. As more and more people come under the sway of regressive ideologies, the demonization of identity groups, lies, fake news, conspiracy theories, science denialism, trolling, avalanches of bullshit, and performances of unaccountability to evidence and reason, they're less and less inclined to support democracy. But at the same time, they're also winning a lot of elections. So these people cannot be dismissed as fringe lunatics. Our problem is not, right, to exclude them, but rather to bring them back into the democratic fold. And in the second place, democracy is constitutively committed to the inclusion as equals of all the citizens, and indeed, I would argue, denizens of the polity. So the challenge we face is to find a way to include the people with regressive views within democracy's scope of normative concern and within democratic discourse itself, even while refusing their regressive terms of engagement as well as the terms in which they express their grievances. To do this, we need a theory of regress and not just a theory of progress. Such a theory would include an account of the moral and emotional biases that, when they are activated, lead people to support regressive political movements and parties. Now, if people's motives were merely narrow self-interest, politics as usual would work. Democratic politics knows how to deal with conflicts of mere interest. What we have to contend with are far more politically dangerous motives that have been activated in the current era. Things such as religious fanaticism, particularly important in the United States, if not elsewhere, ethnocentrism, the quest for glory over rival identity groups, wounded narcissism, and the spirit of vengeance-driven nihilistic destruction. So, once we identify those toxic motives that are poisonous to democracy, then with the help of social scientific investigation, as well as the cultivation of empathetic and dialogic practice, we have to learn how to block or counteract the factors that activate such irrational biases and draw out the better angels of other people's natures. What might this look like? Well, there's a lot of things that, say, liberals and Democrats recently have failed to do that really need to be done, like simply showing up and attentively listening to others. That has remarkable interpersonal effects. Nevertheless, we see within the Democratic Party a systematic failure even to run candidates in rural districts. Well, it's not surprising that if you don't even show up and listen to people that they think that they're not in your corner. Right? At least show up. Simple acts that show that one cares about them, from friendly reciprocation to actively help when they ask for it. Like, that's really useful. Practices of respect and concern tend to deactivate hostile motives, trigger reciprocity in the positive sense, and activate interpersonal trust. With the emotional groundwork laid for mutually respectful discourse, we can move on to acknowledge the genuine problems faced by supporters of regressive movements. And we do not need to accept the terms in which they understand their pain to acknowledge that many are suffering losses of respect and esteem, as well as ways to make a living and raise families. For example, as far as the losses of respect and esteem go, people rightly feel insulted when others talk down to them. Much of the resentment that working class people have toward the college educated stems from that kind of talking down. People feel dismissed when their experiences are minimized in the abstract discourse of policies and principles. Anyone committed to democracy needs to avoid talking down to, dismissing, and insulting those they disagree with. And here I just want, as a case in point of successful discourse by someone on the left, Bernie Sanders went around West Virginia, a heavily, deeply, deeply red state, and he won accolades talking to ordinary people because he genuinely shares and expresses anger over how Big Pharma targeted people in West Virginia for the opioid crisis, for exploitation during that crisis, and of course, totally justified anger at how the medical system generally makes healthcare unaffordable and drives people into bankruptcy. And he won huge accolades from people who voted for Trump. In stressing the political importance of respectful and empathetic practices of communication, I'm highlighting one of the great themes of pragmatism highlighted by John Dewey. And that is that democracy is not just a system of laws, it's a cultural practice of everyday citizen-to-citizen communication and cooperation. And indeed, communication and cooperation between the citizens and the permanent residents, the denizens of a polity. Showing up, showing care, showing respect for one another, even while they disagree about policies. Political progress, then, cannot be measured solely in terms of the satisfaction of abstract principles of justice alone. A progressive political constitution will fail if it's not supported by a culture of equality, regularly practiced in citizen-to-citizen communication and cooperation. Thank you.
Philip.
Okay, yes, my microphone is on. So when you agree to give some comments on a lecture without actually hearing the lecture or getting a draft of it, you wonder how it's going to go, what's going to be said. And since you're supposed to you're expected to sort of criticize and offer suggestions for improvement, you can find yourself really in a bit of a bind if it turns out that you agree a lot with the person who's given. And that's my bind today. So what I'm going to do is something rather different from the standard, Leah EP says this and I disagree because of this. I'm actually going to present from a different point of view and using different language, a position that I think is close to hers. So she has three main aims. First of all, she hopes to show that political progress is a species of moral progress. I agree with that. Second, she wants to show why this concept is important. And I think she's dead right about that too. And I think her explanation is actually quite convincing. And then she gives us some criteria. And here I'm more inclined to raise a few doubts, but I'm not sure how far apart we are. So, for me, we start this enterprise by thinking about how we might do political progress, human progress, social progress, legal progress, moral progress, better than we now do it. How can we make it more systematic, less insecure, less vulnerable to change than it's been in the past? So I begin there, and what I look for are methods for making our future progress more secure and more permanent than our past ones have been. And at the very beginning, then, I have to take on something that Leah clearly identifies, namely the fact that there's a lot of skepticism about progress. You heard some of it in the question period yesterday. Now, why does that arise? I think it arises from two main sources. One is a sense that, things that people call progress and things that people call regress are somehow mixed up together. So we talk about these large-scale episodes in which there are gains, but there are also losses, and it's not clear how you balance the gains against the losses, and so on and so forth. That's one ground. The other ground, often voiced by historians, I think, is opposition to a goal-directed view of history. You can't think of history as aiming towards a goal, and therefore, you can't think in terms of progress. Now, I want to begin by responding to these two general kinds of concerns. I think the first kind of concern can be handled best by focusing on the notion of progress as it occurs in very simple cases. We talk about patients making progress. We talk about kids making progress when they learn to play musical instruments. What's going on there? There's an earlier state, there's a later state. And in some sense, we think that the later state is better or is an advance on the earlier state. So focus on the notion of a transition. Some transitions might be rather large, but then the ones I've pointed to are, of course, rather small. But there are transitions in our human history, like, for example, when you give up on slavery. You go from a state where there are slaves to a state where there aren't slaves. Can you see that as a transition in which there's a very clear advance? I think you can. So I'm skeptical of some of the talk that goes on in discussions of progress, which seems to me to sort of take things at too gross a level and, as it were, mix all kinds of ingredients, and that makes it more difficult to do the accounting. So I want to urge Leah to begin just simply by thinking about state transitions, which can be clearly specified and perhaps can be understood in an unambiguous way. And it seems to me that there are such transitions that occur in history. Some of them are quite small, but some of them, like the abolition of slavery, are quite large. What about the goal-directed stuff? Well, we often think of progress in terms of a journey, right? We've got a destination. We make progress by getting closer to the destination. When we look at human history, it doesn't look very much like that because, utopians aside, we don't have a very clear specification of what as it were, the end point is supposed to be. But I think that besides progress to, there's also progress from. This is something I call pragmatic progress. Yeah, I'm a member of the club too. And I think of it as in terms of overcoming problems. There's something problematic in the early state that is improved in the later state. So I would urge Leah always to talk, and she slid a little bit yesterday in presenting this, about progress away from injustice. The long arc of history bends away from injustice. Martin Luther King and Theodore Parker before him, I think, got it wrong in thinking about it bending towards justice. I think it bends away from injustice. Okay, now if somebody who thinks about progress in goal-directed terms has the problem of saying what the goal is, somebody who thinks about progress as progress from, pragmatic progress, has a different kind of problem. We have to say when a situation is properly identified as problematic. And I think Leah is perhaps a little too casual about this. It emerges somewhat late in her lecture when she starts talking about crises of legislation. But I think we need a handle on the notion of a problematic situation and how we might identify one. As I see it, situations are problematic, or prima facie problematic, I should say, when there are people who complain about them. There are, of course, undetected problems. I mean, my own children, my own grown-up children, the elder of whom was born actually in this place in Michigan, when they think about the ways in which people who loved members of their own sex were treated, back in my childhood, they think, how on earth could anybody have thought that that was an acceptable way of proceeding? How could they have believed that? Why were they so blind? That sense of our escaping blindness, I think, emphasizes the need that we have in thinking about progress, of what makes something problematic. I think there is a genuine task, which I don't know how to accomplish, about trying to, as it were, identify problems before anybody has, as it were, expressed worry about a situation. But I'll focus for now on what William James famously called the cries of the wounded. Now, the trouble with the cries of the wounded is that they are sometimes bits of hypochondria. And another trouble is, of course, that sometimes Spartans, Stoics are wounded and don't even cry. So we've got really two problems to solve here. Okay, what we need is a method of moral inquiry that will enable us to detect the genuine wounded from those who are simply whiners and complainers. And if we could extend it also to identify problems that have not yet been unearthed in any kinds of cries or complaints, that would be even better. Okay, how might you do that? Well, I think the best way to do this is to do what Leah recommended yesterday. She gave the insight to Machiavelli, look to history. I actually thought of it, not having perhaps read Machiavelli as carefully as I should have, as a Kuhnian strategy, exemplified by Kuhn with respect to scientific progress. So try to find common features of situations in which you think advances were made, features that are absent in places and at times where things seem to be going backwards or being delayed. Okay, So I've looked in my work on moral progress at 3 historical cases. They are the usual suspects. Okay, abolition of chattel slavery in the New World, expansion of opportunities for women, roughly from Mary Wollstonecraft to the present, and I hope beyond, and something I've seen in my own lifetime, namely the increasing acceptance of same-sex love. Now, when you look at the histories here, and look at the details of the histories, and I think both Liz and I like looking at the details of histories, what you find is that two obvious features stand out. One is the increasing recognition of people who have previously been ignored, but people who are affected by a particular issue. The second is, of course, the mundane thing of getting the facts straight. I mean, lots of things change in the abolition movement when it becomes clear that black people who have been enslaved can do the sorts of things that it's been denied that they do. But less evident, but I think absolutely crucially important, of fundamental importance, is the willingness of people to enter into the minds of one another, and for members of the affected groups by a particular issue, to enter into dialogue with one another in ways that enable them to understand one another's positions and one another's lives and one another's feelings. This isn't just a matter of cold reasoning. It's a matter, as I've sometimes said, of entering into that person's life so that you can see the world from their eyes and feel the world through their skins. Come to terms emotionally with their fears, their hopes, their aspirations, and their frustrations. Now, I need to say a lot more about this. Sarah Buss has been prodding me for a while to try to give a clearer and tidier account, but I can't give one today, so I'm just going to leave it with that suggestive language. And I'm going to give you a proposal for how we might identify moral problems and moral progress. I'm starting with the moral case because I think the moral is actually fundamental here, and I think I agree with Leah on this. So, I think the method of moral inquiry must involve collective deliberation, and that deliberation must, insofar as it can, aim to be inclusive of the perspectives of those affected. It must represent all of the perspectives if it can. It must get the facts straight. It must not rely on things for which there's little evidence. And finally, each of the participants must try to enter into the lives of each of the others and aim at a solution that all can tolerate. This is difficult to achieve, but there are experiments that are quite hopeful. Quite a lot can be done by, as it were, giving people norms for their conversation, telling them how they have to behave in this kind of deliberation. Psychologists are working on this at the moment. So let me give you a proposed account of moral progress. I'm going to phrase this in a way that is quite sort of, it's initially strange. It's a sort of philosopher's attempt to dot the I's and cross the T's, although I'm pretty sure I haven't. Someone is justified in identifying a situation as morally problematic when they recognize evidence that an ideal deliberation or an approximation to one would conclude that it is morally problematic. So you try to imagine how people coming together from various perspectives could find some sort of consensus on it. Second, someone is justified as taking a transition to constitute moral progress when it's justifiable to claim that the earlier state is morally problematic, and further, they recognize evidence that a deliberation of this kind would regard the later state as amending the problem, at least to some extent. Okay, all of that is about our justification for saying that a state is morally problematic and that something counts as a case of moral progress. Now I say a transition is morally progressive when the justification of it as morally progressive would survive as we continue to try to organize our lives together through the kinds of experiments that Liz was talking about, using the kind of methodology that I have suggested for moral inquiry. Now, I'm sure all of this needs some tidying up, and there's a lot of work to be done. But I do think that our moral progress, as when we make it, relies on our approximating the kinds of conditions I've put in place. And it would become more systematic, more secure, less vulnerable to backsliding if we institutionalized the best approximations we can make to this form of deliberation. That would yield a richer notion of democracy. And I'm going to do what you did. One, answering to Dewey's claim, a democracy is more than a form of government. It is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. Okay, so how does this relate to what Leah says? Well, she sees politics as a way of further specifying moral norms, and it comes into play when moral norms are insufficiently reliable. I think she's got an insight here. There are cases in which people assimilate a moral norm and they reliably act upon it, or relatively reliably act upon it. There are other cases in which social sanction, always remember Mill on the power of social sanction, is good enough to get people to conform to the norm. But sometimes you need the power of the state, often, of course, exerted through the legal structures. You make laws to keep people in line. Now, I think, and this is where I'm going to start to wander away from Leah, I think that political progress can occur in many different ways. I'm going to give 4 examples, but I don't think that these are all the ones there are. The first one is that a view about a moral question may shift, and that may then lead to a political change in which authorities enforce the new moral belief. They translate it into law, say. But the new moral awareness may do something completely different than that kind of enforcement. It may simply get rid of a practice that we've had, like getting rid of slavery or getting rid of criminalizing gay people, okay? But it can also do something different. It can modify the structures of authority themselves, as, for example, in limiting what the monarch is supposed to do. If you're in a monarchical society, if I look back at the history of my own native land, I mean, there are lots of cases in which you make political progress by revising the authority structures so that the monarch can do less. And finally, a political progress event may occur through the development of a technology. So in the 1990s, I was involved in looking at the Human Genome Project as it was in prospect, and the worry was that certain kinds of uses of genomic sequencing would do bad things. And so there were bodies constituted, of which I was part of one, to try to figure this out. So you've got this new technology, you've got an existing worthwhile goal, you want to detect the people who are genuinely guilty of crimes. Why not use DNA sequencing to try to round up the suspects and find out who's genuinely guilty? That takes a lot of work, and it introduces a completely new moral question. Namely, are we justified in using this means to pursue this worthy end? So there are these 4 things, and I'm not sure they can all be subsumed under Leah's notion of functional refinement. Okay, now I want to conclude by doing something bolder and more, and as it were, perhaps more challenging. So Leah tells us that one plausible way to understand moral progress is to see it as a process of functional refinement of other regarding norms, a way of remedying altruism failures. That's exactly the way in which I once understood moral progress when I wrote a book called The Ethical Project. But I've changed my mind. I have been moved by commentators who've said, no, it's not always about altruism failures. Sometimes, as you understand them, which is basically accommodating your preferences and wishes to preferences of another person. No. Sometimes what happens is that two people have particular goals and preferences, and then they end up doing something that neither of them had envisaged before. A couple of I's become a we, or many I's become a we, and they've got a project in mind that they now all pursue. Same sort of thing is going on, but it's not exactly remedying altruism failures. What's happening is that people are responding to one another. Okay, now, this capacity that we have for responding to others and modifying our behavior and sometimes generating new cooperative projects is really, really ancient in our species because it's there in the chimps and the bonobos. They can do it too. They do it in very limited ways, and their societies often break down or run into trouble or have to go through long processes of peacemaking because their ability to respond to one another is so limited. But they can do it to some extent, and that helps. So it probably descends from this capacity, responsiveness, probably descends from our last common ancestor with the chimps and the bonobos, which is roughly 5 million years ago. So it's been going on for a long time. Up to maybe 20,000, maybe 30,000 years ago, we were living in societies of roughly the same size as the chimps and the bonobos. But since then, things have changed. Okay, so 10,000 years ago, people were living together in cities of roughly 1,000. By 4,000 years ago, the last texts that we have, the oldest texts that have survived to the present day, show complex systems of rules for Mesopotamian cities to work together. So ethical life governed by agreed upon rules, is pretty old. Well, how old exactly? At least 25,000 years, because that's when we have evidence of trade. A great archaeologist, Colin Renfrew, did some brilliant historical detective work and showed that there were trading networks 25,000 years ago. That date has now been pushed back. I don't know how far it can go. But if our ancestors were cooperating in neighboring bands and coming together and trading goods 25,000 years ago, maybe 30,000 years ago, then they had an agreed upon system of rules. And if that system of rules operated between previously hostile bands, then it presumably developed much earlier in our own species within the band. I don't know how old it is. My guess is somewhere on the order of 50,000 to 100,000 years ago. So there's an awful lot of history and an awful lot of progress that goes on long before we get to things like the abolition of slavery and the expansion of opportunities for women. So how did all this work? Well, we can see in history a pattern of responsiveness to others in continual conflict with selfish tendencies and, as Liz pointed out, all sorts of biases and prejudices. Now, I want to tell the story of this progress somewhat differently from the way that Leah does. I mean, she seems to see things in terms of a moral advance that is translated politically into a new way of shaping behavior. And once we've got that, then there's a process, she calls it functional refinement, as I once did, but I don't believe in that anymore. She sees that as something that, as it were, can, as it were, go on by itself within the same structure. I see a constant need for the moral to re-enter and the moral method to be part of it. I don't think we can just simply think of authorities or governmental structures as refining this. I think we have to think of a continual process in which moral inquiry goes on again and again and again and tries to build on the advances that previous moral inquiries have generated. So for me, this idea of deliberative, democratic discussion that is not simply a matter of sort of cold presentation of reasons, but genuine engagement with our fellows is the core of a method that must be there in our politics all the time. I told you I was going to try to deepen democracy in Dewey's way and make it about shared life experience, dialogue entering other people's minds. I think we've lapsed from what happened in hunter-gatherers in the Paleolithic. I think they used the same kinds of methods that I've been recommending, which their descendants in the contemporary world still use. The Inuit, the Kung still use these kinds of methods. But I think we've lost this in our complex states with millions of citizens. Of course, we need a central authority with administrative powers, but we go wrong when we think that moral authority can be given to an individual position, an individual occupant of a position. It can't be given to a single person or to a non-representative group of people. It is wrong to think that moral insight and moral progress is made by single individuals. In history, I think we understand the sequence. It starts with the seer, the shaman, the priest, then descends to the philosopher, the professional ethicist, and to the President of the United States. I mean, that really is a falling off by the time we get to the last one. It's really a collective matter. We have to work on this together. We do experiments together, but we also have to reflect with one another together on the outcomes and effects of those experiments. So I'm going to conclude very briefly by commending Leah's sense of urgency, which Liz also recognized. Leah is completely correct to suggest that we are facing a time of crisis, and I think she's completely correct to say that there are representative deficits at the systemic level. It's not just about failures of leaders or policies or political corruptions or anything like that. I think she's right. There's a deep defect in our current form of capitalism, a version that's abandoned any thought that markets should be regulated to achieve morally important goals. For the past 50 years, the highly competitive struggle for maximizing productivity has undercut the conditions for ethical life. If you think of the conditions for ethical life as fostering responsiveness to one another, amplifying that responsiveness, what we have done is set up an economic system which rules politics today that is going in completely the opposite direction. And that makes it very difficult for us to address any of the global and local challenges that confront us. That's why I think we're suffering this terrible loss of hope that Liz talked about. The predicament is most evident in the case of climate change. I can't talk about that today, but I can only applaud the investigative work that Leah EP has undertaken in this lecture. It is indeed brilliant. Thank you.
Daniel.
All right, it's a great privilege and honor to be here. So when I think back to 90s politics, one of the many mistakes I recall is the extent to which people were primed to think of progress as inevitable, with the kind of complacency of just expecting that this was the end of history and that Western liberal democracy would triumph universally without any further defense, without any further reactionary forces to fight against. And we now live, as Lee reminds us very forcefully yesterday, in a time of democratic backsliding. We live in a time of regress. One of the things I really admire about this project, one of the many things I admire, is that the hopefulness of the project is a helpful antidote to the way in which many fatalistically treat regress today as inevitable, in exactly the way that people treated progress before. One of the ways in which I think that's a mistake is when we learn from history, there's an uncanny tendency that progress and regress have to follow each other in quite short succession. So as a simple example of this, if we think about the history of race relations, it's been an emerging theme through these comments so far. From the antebellum era, we moved to the Reconstruction era, which was a time of incredible progress on race relations, which was precipitated a great backlash in Jim Crow, which precipitated a great step forward in the Civil Rights era, which precipitated another backlash and another resulting racial backlash through the Nixon and Reagan era. So progress and regress have tended to follow each other in short succession. And this is so common of a pattern, in fact, that there's a recurring metaphor used to describe it of the pendulum swinging back and forth, occurs in a lot of different parts of discourse about moral and political progress. The basic point I want to press today is whether the recognition from history that these pendular swings are normal, that they're in fact the norm, might actually put pressure on a crucial aspect in how Lee Yippee wants to theorize about progress, and in particular put pressure on the role that functional refinement plays within Lee's theory as an account of the measure of progress. So here's the agenda. I'm going to start by saying more about what I mean by the pendulum. Then I'm going to talk about realism and pragmatism, because it turns out you don't have to be a member of the Pragmatist Club. There are alternatives. Then I will talk about the challenge that the pendulum poses to this notion of functional refinement, and then I'll consider some responses. So let's start with the pendulum. I'm just going to have two quick illustrative cases, because I think that's a helpful way of seeing the general idea and seeing its ubiquity. So if you look first on a larger scale at the US Supreme Court over the 20th century, it starts with the Lochner era, where the court is characterized by a kind of economic libertarian activism, pushing back, especially then against FDR most famously. Then the court swings pretty wildly towards the egalitarian activism of the Warren Court. And then it swings again to various forms of conservatism, which are also marked by a kind of federalist restraint under Berger, Rehnquist, and then kind of Justice Scalia's originalism. So these are swings back and forth ideologically between opposing ends. On a smaller scale, then, and on a more interpersonal scale, if you look at one aspect of the expanding moral circle, the better treatment of animals and consumptive behavior, over the last decade, we've seen quite significant swings towards and then away from practices like vegetarianism and veganism, which is, if you're someone like me, you can see reflected not only in like vegan restaurants popping up and then going out of business, but also plant-based meats, like having a precipitous rise on the stock market and then a very, very, very sharp decline. So these are two different examples which I want to use to illustrate these kind of pendular swings to and from better moral norms. In part, and I offer them because I think they're helpful, not only for showing the ubiquity of that pattern, but also for offsetting one way of treating these kind of pendular swings as not reflecting any normative oscillation, not reflecting changes in norms, but just reflecting changes in power. If you just think about things like the Reconstruction era and Jim Crow, it's easy to try and pretend that the normative changes that we see are simply changes in alternating power, falling into the pattern that Lear was so helpfully criticizing yesterday of just treating norms as a kind of mouthpiece for power. I think that's a tendency we should resist. I think it's a tendency we should resist for many reasons, but one of the many is that actually the alternation in who's in power often just follows from alternation in norms. This is especially if you like an account like, the Arthur Schlesinger Tides of American Politics account, where the populace moves back and forth between periods of liberalism and conservatism, and that's exactly why you see alternation in who, is in the White House or who controls Congress. The examples are, I think, helpful in pushing us towards taking this to be genuine normative oscillation between different opposing ideals, rather than just alternating in, who holds power in the legislature or the executive. Okay, so that's what I take the pendulum to be. Let me make three then further comments about it that I think are helpful in clarifying. One is, I think this does seem to be the norm, that we see pendular swings to and from progress and regress. A question would then be why that would be so normal, and there's different hypotheses you could have about that. One I'm kind of tempted by, drawing on some of Liz Anderson's work, is that progress tends to result from social movements engaged in contentious politics. And if you like that kind of hypothesis, it has some natural implications you can draw from it, being that social movements engaged in contentious politics are often guilty of a kind of discrediting overreach. And even when they're not, they can be posing an actual or perceived threat to people's interests and identities that can engender a kind of backlash, engender reactionary forces. So if you have any kind of account like that of what drives progress, you're going to see regresses following in short succession. That would at least be expected, if not the norm. So that's the first comment. The second comment is that I think that the way of seeing this kind of normative oscillation as the norm as being captured by the pendulum can be clarifying, but it can also be a little bit misleading in ways that came out a little bit in one of the comments yesterday. That these kind of pendular swings can suggest perpetual motion, but also stasis, swinging pendulum, but with a fixed midpoint. But nothing I'm saying here suggests that progress and regress are like perfectly equipoised in some kind of Manichaean fashion. We can have pendular swings that move on net towards justice. They just take a lot of swings towards injustice on the path there. And the final comment then is that once we see the pendulum as being the norm and that being consistent with like net movement towards justice, it really is consistent with believing in progress or believing in regress in a meaningful fashion rather than just thinking that all change is cyclical. But it requires us to adjust the common metaphor that when the universe bends towards justice, it does so with anything like the elegant, simple geometry of an arc. Instead, it has something like the geometry of a crazy straw. The move towards justice takes many detours towards injustice along the way. Okay, so that's what I take the pendulum to be. Why might this matter? So I don't think it matters for everyone, and this is going to be helpful then for thinking about a contrast between realist and pragmatist in thinking about theories of progress. So I take it that realism is an option if you don't have Dewey before your professorial title, at least. It's an option. And a realist view of progress is in some ways very, very simple. The realist sees our moral attitudes as having representational content, and that content can be more or less accurate. You can represent some people as having certain obligations towards some others. So these are representations of the subjects, contents, and objects of obligations. And you can be wrong on any one of those fronts. You can falsely represent that women aren't rational and are not the subjects of obligations. You can falsely represent that slavery is permissible rather than forbidden. You can falsely represent that animals are mere things and we have no duties to animals. So you can be inaccurate on any one of those dimensions. And that's a way in which your individual attitudes or our collective attitudes can make progress by moving towards accuracy and away from inaccuracy. That's a very simple, at least, starting point for a realist theory of progress and provides a measure of progress in terms of the accuracy of the underlying moral attitudes. So that's an option, but it's not an option that Lee at least seems very disposed to take. There's no mention of the representational content of our attitudes and no mention of the accuracy of the representations. Instead, Lee's account is falling into this kind of august pragmatist tradition of thinking of morality as a social technology, thinking of moral discourse as having a function, and thinking of moral progress and political progress by extension in terms of the refinement of that function. So this is a different way of thinking about the measure of progress in terms of the functional refinement of ultimately justice in terms of political progress. And here is where I think that the pendulum might have some bite, because there's nothing threatening for the realist in thinking that the path to accuracy in representation might sometimes go via inaccuracy. But I do think there might be something threatening about trying to theorize about progress in terms of functional refinement if, when we learn from history, we see progress and regress so frequently following each other in short succession. Less clear how that fits a model of functional refinement. Okay, so let's talk then about what functional refinement is and why we might see this pressure. So the account of functional refinement we get in Leib's project is building on, as Philip noted, some of the earlier work in the 2011 book, where functional refinement is explained in terms of a sequence of improvements. And improvements basically in function fulfillment. Typically, the examples will fall into kind of three categories in terms of the effectiveness, the reliability, and the efficiency of the fulfillment of a function. So I'm going to give you two illustrative examples of this phenomenon. These are examples I'm offering. I don't think they're exactly the same examples Philip offers, but I think they're helpful in just getting a sense of the phenomenon. So the first is a technological example. So over time, humans moved from using older one flakes, which are basically chipped stones, to, this is like, very early ancestors, 2.7 million years ago roughly, to using Acheulean hand axes, where we had innovations like we sharpened the stones on both edges, made them a lot sharper, but also still made them brittle, still kind of disposed to breaking. Also still heavy, because stone is quite heavy. So then we had the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. We started using metallic blades. Now we use modern metal alloys. And these are all a sequence of tools, but they're tools that are all for the same thing. They're all for cutting. They're just more effective, more reliable, and more efficient in fulfilling that purpose. So it's a simple technological example in the refinement of a function, the function of cutting, by a sequence of tools over time. Second example, if you're seeing me right now, you're using an organ that has a very long evolutionary history. The history starts with light-sensitive skin patches, and then it moves to pinhole eyes, and then it moves to eyes with lenses, then with layers with retina and irises, and then finally to fovea. And they're a sequence of organs which over time all share a function. They're all for detecting and interpreting light, but they're more effective, more reliable, and more efficient at fulfilling that function. So the two simple examples we see kind of in the wild of what functional refinement is meant to be. And I want to really emphasize three features that those examples share, three features of functional refinement in general. The first is that the underlying function is preserved. The tools are still all for cutting. The organs are still all for seeing. The second is we see what we could put technically as monotonic improvements in fulfillment of that function, which is to say changes in one direction. The tools get more effective, more reliable, more efficient. It's not like we went from Alder flakes to Bronze Age knives and then back to Acheulean axes. The change went in one direction, a sequence of improvements, not improvements, then deteriorations and improvements. Finally, those improvements are towards stable equilibria. Once we got, within the constraints we have, the best technology for cutting, it's not like you decided to use an Alder flake yesterday when trying to cut some paper, right? We tend to stick with the best thing we have, and that becomes stable once we've optimized the fulfillment of the function within the constraints we have. So those are three features that functional refinement tends to have in general. Now let's think back to moral and political progress. If it's true that moral and political progress tends to be characterized by these kind of pendulous swings, then I think it shares none of those three features, right? Moral and political progress, as being hypothesized as following a model of functional refinement, is 0 for 3. It doesn't seem clear to me that there's any function that is preserved as we oscillate between norms of racial hierarchy and equality. It seems like we've shifted the function rather than preserved an underlying function. Insofar as there is any underlying function that's preserved, it certainly doesn't seem to me that we've got monotonic improvements. The gains that were made in the Reconstruction era are undone under Jim Crow. The reversals under Jim Crow are then undone in the Civil Rights era. So we've got recurrent reversals rather than monotonic change. And finally, there just aren't stable equilibria, right? The fall of the USSR was meant to be the end of history, according to some, the universal triumph of Western liberal democracy. And less than a few decades later, an authoritarian and liberal regimes are the kind of plat du jour around the world. There aren't stable equilibria. So if progress tends to follow regress in short succession, if the pendulum is the apt metaphor for describing progress we see it in the wild, then it doesn't look like functional refinement is a plausible account of what progress is, because it doesn't have the features of functional refinement in general. Okay, so that's the challenge. Now, let me be clear, I offer the challenge because I think it's helpful to have a skeptical foil as a kind of whetstone for honing in philosophically insightful accounts. And I do think there's a philosophically insightful account. I think there's a lot going for it. This is not meant to be a kind of insurmountable or insoluble problem for the view. So in a constructive spirit, then, let me think about two different ways you could try and respond to the challenge. Keep preserving the pragmatist spirit, assuming that Lee doesn't decide to go with me into the realist camp, or we have kind of shittier beer and worse titles, and wants to stick with the more august colleagues to my right. So first way is you could try and preserve the kind of pragmatist account of progress in terms of functional refinement while making it consistent with this kind of normative oscillation between opposing ideals. And there are models for doing so. So one, taking from biology, is the notion of reverse adaptations. So kind of give you a simple example to illustrate the idea is thinking of gecko's eyes over time. Here's why I would think of gecko's eyes. The broad function of seeing, which, detecting and interpreting light, it actually needs to be made a little bit more specific. You can detect and interpret light prioritizing different things. And an easy way of seeing why is to think of the difference you might have in your head between owl's eyes and hawk's eyes. Owl's eyes are optimized for sensitivity because they're nocturnal. They need to be very sensitive to small changes in light because they see in dim conditions. Hawks see in very, very bright light and they see very sharply. They prioritize acuity in vision, and that's where their eyes are very different. So why do geckos matter here? Because geckos are an example of an organism which over a long period of evolutionary history went from being diurnal to nocturnal to diurnal, and so their eyes changed quite dramatically in various ways to be, more like hawks, to being more like owls, to being more like hawks again, to prioritize acuity, then prioritize sensitivity, to prioritize acuity again. Why would that matter? Well, if you're looking at a very specific dimension of the function of seeing, like acuity, you would see reversals. You would not see monotonic improvements. You would see eyes that became more sharp in vision, and then less sharp, and then more sharp again. You would see these kind of oscillations. But that's consistent with thinking that in respect to the more abstract function, the more general function of detecting and interpreting light, there was functional refinement over time. There was an underlying function that was preserved. It was optimized over time incrementally. And there were, in fact, still stable equilibria across the history of geckos. So that's a kind of model you could have where you're still thinking that functional refinement is the measure of progress, but it is consistent with observing that progress in the wild tends to involve these pendular swings between opposing ideals. It would just require to take the opposing ideals to be along specific dimensions rather than with respect to the overarching function. And I think that's a hypothesis actually very congenial for Leah's account because the observation that you need to get it to work is thinking that the function is something more abstract. And when I was reading Leah Yippie's work for these lectures, Leah actually characterizes, when you look at it, the function of justice in quite abstract terms. The function of justice is answering demands for the legitimation of the use of power, the use of coercive force. And that's quite capacious. That can accommodate quite different, more specific ends that would be different ways or different dimensions of legitimating the use of coercive force with respect to kind of these political structures. Okay, so that looks like a model, looks like a model for a quite nice response on Leah's behalf. Here's ultimately why I don't think that you'd want to take that as being the answer. If you were trying to hypothesize that the way in which the US across its history from the antebellum era to today had swung between norms of racial hierarchy and racial equality as being equivalent to how gecko's eyes had swung between acuity and sensitivity and vision, then you would have to think that hierarchy and equality were different dimensions of justice, and swinging from one to the other was just optimizing a different dimension of justice. But that would require you to lose the important insight that the normative oscillations we see are oscillations between progress and regress. Because you would now be saying that in the Jim Crow era, that was like gecko's eyes switching to being more like owl's eyes, and it was just optimizing in a different way. But they were not optimizing in a different way. That was a regressive change. So I think you would end up being more like Hegel or more like the various political commentators of the 90s in thinking that progress was inevitable, because all of the change, all of the institutional change would end up being progressive, just progressive along a different dimension. And insofar as I think that the pendulum is swinging between progress and regress, I think that actually puts a lot of pressure, the recognition of that puts a lot of pressure on an account of progress in terms of functional refinement, because it makes it very hard to see that there's any continuity of the function or monotonic improvement in the fulfillment of the function. Rather, it just seems like abrupt changes between functions with any incremental improvements being undone successively across generations. Okay, so that's one response. Preserve the account of progress in terms of functional refinement and make functional refinement compatible with these normative oscillations. The alternative response to that then would be to retain, I would take it, because I assume Leah doesn't want to go with me as a realist, retain the pragmatist spirit of the account, but not use functional refinement as the measure of progress. And I think that is definitely a response that's open to Leah. It's interesting, actually, that Liz Anderson's kind of pragmatist account of progress doesn't heavily feature functional refinement or even teleological talk as being central to the account of what progress consists of. It's also the case that, as Philip's own comments were bringing out, Philip's more recent work doesn't appeal to functional refinement centrally and giving an account of what progress consists of. So there's lots of options there within a pragmatist account, but I want to note that those options might actually have some costs, and they might have costs that Leah Yippie's own account of progress in terms of functional refinement is better suited to avoid. So if we focus in particular on like Philip's more recent work, which we're getting a kind of sketch of in Philip's comments, there's this kind of democratic contractualist account that we get in the 2023 book is trying to provide a pragmatist measure of progress in terms of idealized intersubjective agreement and on both problems and solutions to problems. That's roughly the account that we just saw sketched. And I think that there's some really significant questions that you face about that account that Leah can easily avoid. So some of those are questions about agreements between whom. So just like for contractualists in general, it's hard to make this account work for all of the kinds of progress we might want to theorize about, including, for instance, progress in the better treatment of animals. Because it's hard to see all animals as part of an agreement with us. You know, maybe I communicate with my dog, but I certainly don't communicate with ants. And like even E.O. Wilson doesn't communicate with ants. But I take very seriously, like Jeff Sebo's work, that it might be that we've got to expand the moral circle further to be more inclusive of insects. Or if you don't buy that, think about human generations across time. You know, agreements between us and all future affected persons is quite hard to theorize about within an account of idealized intersubjective agreement, simply because not only do those people not exist, but which people will exist depends on what agreement we make in the first place. So that's one problem, agreements between whom. Another problem is agreement on what terms. The account is meant to be a kind of idealized agreement in a form of democratic contractualism, but that seems to presuppose some of the very democratic norms that were meant to then provide an account of progress on those same norms. And it's hard to see how we then use the account to provide a measure of progress on democracy in the same way that it's hard to use a ruler to provide a measure of itself. Leah's account, I think, can avoid those problems because functional refinement can occur between humans and non-human animals. You know, symbiosis is a reality. And also political functions can be explained on this account between us and successive generations. There's actually a lot of interesting work you can draw on there on like constitutional norms as a form of political insurance on forms of unideal change in successive generations of politics. So I think Leah's account in terms of functional refinement has really nice features that other pragmatist accounts might not share. So there might be significant costs for pragmatists in taking the challenge I'm posing here, just push you to wholesale reject the kind of foundational idea in Leah's account of what political progress is. So where does that leave the account? I don't know. But that's ultimately not my goal. The goal here is just to provide a kind of realist foil, hopefully as this kind of whetstone to better hone the insights in Leah's account. And thank you so much. It's a total pleasure to think about this.
I don't know about the audience. My brain is full, but we now are going to hear an answer to these wonderful comments and critiques. Leah.
Thank you very much. I hope I'll manage to keep my answer to 20 minutes. And yeah, if I go just a little. So, well, first of all, let me say thank you very much to all three of you for such rich and generous commentaries. And I really appreciate the fact that all three of you actually take the core concern for granted, because at least that means that what we're doing is a common endeavor. And I really appreciate the fact that actually all of you agree with this idea that we need to think about political progress as a species of moral progress, which is not what everyone who thinks about political philosophy and thinks about moral questions in public life necessarily agrees with. So I'll take these. Well, I'll take the comments in the order in which they came. So I'll start with Liz, and I will sort of agree with everything she said in the first part of the talk, and with the friendly amendments I will just take on board, so I'm not going to respond to that. Maybe I'll just respond to the question that she asked, the kind of critical political questions, which is that, which is also the most politically urgent question of my account. That is to say, how do we respond to movements that we see as regressive, in particular when they're, as you say, electorally successful and dominate public opinion and can't really be dismissed as fringe phenomena? And as she says, if we exclude these movements from normative attention, are we not making a kind of self-defeating error for democracy? Can a theory of political progress just exclude them? So maybe I'll explain a little bit what I meant in the paper when I said that what I meant by exclusion from normative attention, and then go to this suggestion that Liz makes, which is that we need a theory of regress as well as a theory of progress. So when I say that movements are excluded from normative attention, I don't really mean to say that they should be excluded from democratic discourse, or that they should be prevented from speaking, or that they should be treated as beyond the pale of political engagement. I think this was one of the questions that came out yesterday as well, because I do think, and I agree here, that it would be self-defeated. It would be both strategically self-defeating, because it would alienate potential allies and would also drive those movements even more towards extremism. And it would also be theoretically self-defeating because it violates, as Liz rightly points out, the inclusive character of democratic deliberation. So what I meant when I said that they need to be excluded from normative attention was thinking more about these three criteria that I have. One is diagnostic, one is innovating, and one is heuristic. And it was more specific because what I meant was at the innovating stage of the framework, when we're asking which political movements give us resources for articulating improved theories of justice and improved principles, those kinds of claims don't necessarily need to be included at that stage of the analysis. So that was the example I gave in the paper was of contemporary racist or xenophobic movements that just seek to exclude certain groups from equal standing. Of course, we engage democratically with these groups, and of course, we try to understand their grievances, and we compete for their votes, and we take the democratic deliberation further. We argue against their position in the public sphere. But when we're constructing, when we're thinking in a forward-looking way about what kind of new theories of justice we need to accommodate these concerns and commitments, it seems to me that we can exclude some of their normative claims about equal standing, for example, about how we think about the scope of the demos. And because doing so would represent a regress in the function of justice, as I understand it. It would make power less justifiable, not more justifiable to everyone who is subjected to it somehow. So I think exclusion from normative attention at this innovating stage is compatible and actually requires inclusion in the democratic debate and engagement with these movements politically, while we refuse to take their regressive normative commitments as contributions to innovation. This is what I meant. So now the next question, which is, do we need a theory of regress for this? And specifically, as Liz says, a theory of the kind of moral and emotional biases that activate support for regressive movements. And as she says, right, once we identify these toxic motives, we can also learn how to counter and to block them. And I agree that understanding the psychological and the social mechanisms that support these regressive movements is crucial. But I do want to resist the implication that this requires a separate theory of regress as opposed to something that can be worked out from a kind of account of progress that, along the lines of the pragmatic theory that I was suggesting. And that's because, on my account, basically regress occurs when institutions move away from performing this justice function, so when power becomes less justifiable to people who are subjected to it. And we can identify regress with the same kind of criteria that we think about when we think about progress, just use them in reverse. And so we could say, what is a diagnostic failure? It's a failure of a group that misidentifies the sources of political conflict. So racists, for example, think that it's immigrants, or MAGA people think it's foreigners that are undermining claims to public resources, and so attribute problems to scapegoated groups rather than to structural failures of institutions. Or we can say theory of regress has an account of what is a failure of innovation, for example. So a movement abandons the prior normative achievements and doesn't build on them, so just goes back. Or you can talk about heuristic failure, so a movement doesn't really give you resources for addressing future challenges. As, again, if you think about climate change, for example, that seems to be a very obvious shortcoming of those kinds of movement. So it seems to me that the kind of psychological and emotional mechanisms that you're pointing to, fear and resentment and status anxiety and tribal identification, they're important to explain why people support these regressive movements. But the normative assessment of whether a movement is regressive doesn't depend on the identification of these motives, I think. And I hope you agree with that. And it depends on whether the movement contributes or undermines the functional refinement of justice. And maybe you would frame it exactly in those terms, but I hope we're sort of in agreement here about the moral framework broadly. And this matters because it seems to me that if we're just thinking about emotions and biases, well, the same emotions and biases that support progressive groups can also support regressive movements and the other way around. So, whether it's anger at injustice or whether it's solidarity with one's group or whether it's fear of domination, they can be part of abolitionism and a civil rights movement just as they can be part of xenophobia or authoritarianism. And so what distinguishes progressive from regressive movements on my account is not the emotions that are involved, but whether they expand or contract the scope of who ought to be included. And I agree, again, that it's really important to pay attention empirically to all of these features, but somehow they're not what is driving forward the justification and the moral account that I am trying to put forward. So maybe just finally, with a kind of deeper challenge, which is that the movements are actually winning, and so they're winning elections, and doesn't their electoral success somehow gives them claim to democratic legitimacy? That seems to me a democratically very plausible question. And here, again, I want to distinguish between maybe two different questions. So first, do these electoral successful movements have a right to participate in democratic politics, and we have an obligation to engage with them? Yes, absolutely, and I think you're right to press on that and to help me sort of make that even more clear, because actually any attempt to exclude them would be regressive itself. But second, do electorally successful movements contribute to the functional refinement of justice? That I'm not so sure about. So it seems to me for that we need a sort of philosophical step that is one step removed from political reality, because I think electoral success is not the same as normative progress. And this is something that we need to resist also with many liberals who think, well, these views are winning votes. And so clearly that is what legitimacy is about. That is what democracy is about. A movement can win elections while advocating for principles that make power less justifiable and that narrow the scope of inclusion and actually also abandons previous and prior achievements in the area of equal citizenship. So that's, I think, actually what I mean by legitimation crisis, and that's why we are now experiencing a kind of legitimation crisis, because movements that undermine the function of justice get electoral power. This shows that there is a divorce between democratic procedures and requirements of legitimacy, at least on my account. So I think, in a way, regressive movements gain power because conditions depart from the ideal deliberation that we were talking about. I'll go back to that in a minute. And so bringing people back into democratic discourse means creating the institutional conditions that bring us closer to this justification of power, which is the same as the refinement, as I see, the refinement of the function of justice. Okay, so maybe I move now to Philip. And here I'm in the very unfortunate position of, there was once a scholar of Lukács called Lucien Goldman, who spent his entire life trying to defend the early Lukács against Lukács himself. Lukács himself, because the latter Lukács had changed his mind on the earlier Lukács, and so Goldman kept going to him and saying, but look, you were right. And he said, no, I was wrong. So I hope I'm not going to be in that position. I'm just going to maybe see if I can reformulate some of my concerns and maybe also explain, and this will be connected then to what I say to Daniel and reply, maybe explain why I found helpful to talk about functional refinement of justice and why I didn't think that it was a good idea to move on full-blown to ideal deliberation. But I think Philip is right to sort of press me on the fact that there is a kind of assumption, maybe in the earlier sections of my lecture, where we take the notion of a moral problem for granted, and his concern is, again, sort of methodological and comes with this proposal that is to say that if we understand moral problems through counterfactual procedure of ideal deliberation, I'm sort of sympathetic to this account. And so I'm going to try and see if I can say what you say in my words and see if we can kind of meet somewhere halfway. When I speak of political conflicts as revealing crises of legitimation, I think I'm pointing to something like what you call the cries of the wounded. Mm-hmm. And so I also acknowledge that there is this important caveat, as you were saying, that the wounded don't always cry and the unwounded sometimes complain. And so that's precisely why I emphasize this diagnostic criterion as the first stage of functional refinement, which is a diagnostic criterion is more than just registering complaints. It's about sort of combining philosophical and empirical analysis to think about whether complaints reveal genuine conflicts at the appropriate level of analysis and conflicts that actually can expose the limits of justificatory frameworks. So I think it's compatible, but rather I would frame it differently, because rather than asking, what an ideal deliberation would conclude about whether a situation is morally problematic or not, what I'm asking is whether existing justificatory frameworks can address the concerns that are expressed by political agents under conditions of real-life conflict. And so I think here I'm more with Liz on the sort of non-ideal dimension, and it seems to me that you go too far now in the ideal direction and that we need somehow to meet somewhere in the middle, because this, I think, shifts the emphasis from a purely counterfactual procedure to a more historically situated analysis of actual struggles and actual conflict that reveals these tensions between power and its justification. Now, you raise this other concern, which is whether my account of refinement then focuses on the political and it's too restrictive, so we could have a more expansive account, and whether all instances of progress can be subsumed under functional refinement. And when I say that there is a refinement of justice-based norms, I don't mean to say that authorities just arrive at moral advances and then they implement them, because the refinement includes contestation, includes democratic deliberation, includes efforts at improving the methods of democratic deliberation through movements, protests, intellectual work, the work of party systems, interventions at the level of representative politics, actually. And so it seems to me that, again, the kind of criteria that I was suggesting are supposed to help us analyze and engage in a slightly more detailed way with this messy historical process. And it's not just to kind of replace it with the political understood as expert judgment or the law or something perhaps more top-down. So it seems to me that the role of political philosophy here is reconstructive and critical. It's not just about informing the legislation and then the legislation does their thing and the political does their thing. So I hope if we articulate these principles and we think about this connection between philosophy and practice in a more dialectical way, maybe we only have a difference of emphasis left. I don't know. I mean, we'll see. As I say, my account, your ideal deliberation gives us a kind of procedural account of how we should conduct moral inquiry. And I hope that the functional account emphasizes how you can retrospectively assess real historical developments and historical processes by thinking also about the way in which power shapes what people's normative expectations and the way they develop also politically over time. And I think of them still as complementary rather than competing approaches. And so one might even say that, I don't know, ideal deliberation is the kind of procedural means by which functional refinement occurs, or at least that approximations to ideal deliberation are the kind of mechanism through which justice-based norms are refined over time. So I think, maybe hopefully that we'll see. We can carry on talking about this. This would be one proposal for how we could actually meet halfway or reconcile these two approaches. And this takes me now because the way I'm answering this is now exposing me to the dilemma that Daniel was putting forward, which is this pendulum dilemma. So on the one hand, we have this normative oscillation, so swings between opposing ideals like racial hierarchy and equality, or between, libertarian and egalitarian approaches, and that seems to be the norm in political history. On the other hand, as Daniel says, if we think about functional refinement along the lines of analogy with function statements in, for example, biology, that is exemplified by things like cutting tools or development of visual organs. This seems to have some features that are not quite compatible with how we think about functional refinement in a political sphere. But I wonder whether this challenge rests on an overly restrictive understanding of what functional refinement is when it's applied to the social sciences, so when we're moving away from the biological realm. And in particular, when we're thinking about the kinds of actions that constitute functional refinement and how it works in history, in the social realm. So when I say that political progress involves the functional refinement of justice-based norms, basically, I think of justice something that's different. I don't really think of it exactly like a biological organ. So I will explain, or like a property, like a biological property. So I think the analogy is kind of useful, but it shouldn't be taken as final, because it also risks being misleading. Because social institutions are not biological organs, and so the processes through which they develop, I think, are fundamentally different from either biological evolution or pure technological innovation. And the key difference, I think, is that biological organs and technological artifacts have relatively determinate functions that maybe can be specified independently of contestation around that function. So this is something that I was trying to get at yesterday when Kant talks about progress, and he says, well, it's something that doesn't always go that way, but it's something that also depends on what the prophet says about themselves and what they take themselves to be doing. So there is a kind of reflexive dimension which enters in the social and political realm that complicates the analogy with the biological realm. But I think it's good news for me, because so I think we can agree that, certain, I don't know, the eyes are for seeing and the knives are for cutting, and we can disagree about how well eyes perform their function. But in the political realm, interpretations over the proper function of justice actually change and condition what justice is supposed to accomplish and are themselves subject to contestation and to revision. And that's why I emphasize that the function of justice is to exercise, to regulate the exercise of power in ways that can be justified to everyone that is subjected to it. This is kind of deliberately abstract, but it's abstract for a reason, because it needs to be capacious enough to accommodate these shifts in how people understand words like power and justice and justification, and what principles can justify the exercise. And those are themselves, I think, results of historical developments and historical achievement. Now, does this mean that every swing of the pendulum counts as progress? I don't think it does. So, and here I think, there is no underlying functional continuity, no in the accumulation of understanding and preservation of achievements. In the case of biological things, it's just arbitrary shift between one practice and another. But real political pendular swings aren't really like that. So think about the example of race relations in the United States, as you say, the transition from the Jim Crow to the civil rights movement and beyond. Should we think of this just as an oscillation between, hierarchy and equality, or between progress followed by regress and followed by progress? I don't think so, because I think even in periods of regress, like the Jim Crow movement, important normative achievements were preserved. And the constitutional amendments, for example, that were passed during the Reconstruction remained in force, so that even when they were systematically violated, the civil rights movement could go back and think about those legal interventions to reclaim certain access to public sphere. So the strategy actually built on these constitutional achievements and then used them as leverage to challenge segregation. So that means that the pendulum didn't go back all the way. It went back a little bit, but that meant that there was something entrenched there that was being preserved and carried forward. And actually, and for me this is really important, the very fact that Jim Crow required this elaborate ideological justification, like, it presented itself as separate but equal, or something like that. It required, rather than just saying it's simple racial hierarchy, this suggests that there was some progress that it was building on in the functional refinement of justice, such that certain things had just become unsayable. Of course, they are regressive in many ways, or we can think about the present moment. It's exactly the same thing. Some things are unsayable, even though what those movements are saying are actually quite similar to, in spirit at least, because the terms of justification have changed. And so power couldn't be exercised just through explicit appeals to racial inferiority in the same way it had been before abolition. So it seems to me that political progress works in this way. This is what makes the difference between genuine refinement and mere oscillation. It's not the absence of revivals, but whether there is an underlying functional continuity in how we think about the function of justice in its relationship to power, whether there is an accumulation of normative resources, maybe not by the people, by the elites who are at that moment in power, but whether there is something in the legal system, something in the public sphere, something in the political that gives us the resources that we can go to. And so whether these oscillations then also reflect, in my language, the kind of learning processes in which the conflicts reveal the inadequacies of the existing arrangements that generate pressure from revision. So I think, again, I think you're right that, that stable equilibria are kind of more the exception than the norm in politics, but I think this is because, again, it reflects this important difference between political institutions and biological functions, rather than being a kind of fatal problem to my account. So biological organs reach equilibria because evolutionary pressures remain constant over time scales, and political institutions exist in constantly changing social environments. So economic structures evolve, demographic composition shifts, new technologies emerge, and these changes generate new forms of conflict and new demands for legitimation. And that's precisely why I then also emphasize the heuristic criterion, which is about being able to anticipate and to respond to new movements. So I think the lack of stable equilibria in political philosophy, unlike the sort of the natural world, is actually a feature. It's not a bug of the theories, because it reflects the fact that justice is not a static concept. It's a sort of functionally developing one, or historically evolving one, and that it can be continuously revived through contestation. So even if we reach a truly stable equilibrium, which is this world in which there are no conflicts that require revision, we actually there really would have achieved the end of history. And I mean, we would be something like the communist utopia that Marx describes, and for very good reasons. He doesn't want to tell you more about it because he says that we can't really theorize about it. And that's why Marx says it might be something like fishing in the morning and hunting in the afternoon and philosophizing in the evening, because it's not plausible to think about that end of history kind of condition. So the function of justice, returning to my account, is not just to, and this is again to go back to this pendulum, which I think is maybe the most difficult challenge and the sort of the very critical question when it comes to trying to explain how this account works. The function of justice is not to regulate power in any way whatsoever in my account, but it's to regulate power in those that can be justified to the people that are subjected to it. And this rules out forms of power that can't be justified or that depend on just coercion or manipulation or the exclusion of affected parties. And for now we are at this stage, I think, where we can say this about justice. How we got there is a different story, and this is why I don't think we need to resolve this realism versus pragmatism dispute, because we got here. We understand justice like this. It's fine, whether we understood it because justice was always meant to be this, or whether we understood it because we evolved in such a way that we eventually came to see it. I mean, I think for political philosophy, it's not really the most interesting question in a way. The interesting question is what you do with it in terms of assessing real progress. And so I think just maybe I'm going to say something here, because you were suggesting something that goes along the lines of also what Philip was saying, which is that maybe pragmatists should abandon functional refinement and go with a more democratic contractualism, which explains progress in terms of these idealized intersubjective agreement. As you said, and for the reasons that you said, I think this approach has difficulties of specification and who the parties to the agreement are, and how do we think about animals, and what norms govern the agreement itself. And that's why I think the advantage of a middle of the way or a dialectical encounter of the functionalists and the contractualists is perhaps a better way to go, because it doesn't require you to imagine, ideal conversations or to think about, future political institutions. Instead, it directs your attention to actual historical practices and to actual processes of deliberation and to actual conflicts and to the responses that come out. And so we then also assess these processes not just by comparing them to ideal conversations, but by examining how they contribute to this understanding of the function of justice, which is not so different from how Philip understands it. So the justificatory demand is not that different from the ideal deliberation account, but I think just works in a different way we can talk about works in a different way when you're thinking about the relationship between real world institutions. So I think progress isn't monotonic and maybe doesn't tend towards stable equilibria, but I don't think it's mere oscillation either in terms of how we think about political progress, because it involves this accumulation of normative resources and the preservation of achievements, even during periods of regress, as we can see with the example of the Jim Crow era. And it also involves a kind of gradual expansion of people who must be included in the process of justification and what counts as an acceptable justification. So maybe I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, now it's your turn, and I would say that you can ask questions to any of the panelists and to Leah, of course. And the best thing to do would be to line up if you're willing, at one or the other of the microphones. Don't be shy. Here we go.
Okay. Oh, great. Okay. So one of the things, I sort of have a methodological question. One of the things that came up in your talk yesterday, Professor JP, and especially I think in the first two comments, but I think for all three of you, is a lot of kind of like moral psychology language. So talk about care and something sort of like empathy maybe. And I think that seems especially important when we talk about sort of political progress, but also seems important when we talk about lots of different topics in political philosophy, when we talk about democratic deliberation, all these sorts of things. And I'm wondering, can you just like tell us a little bit more about how you think about these sort of psychological concepts and like phenomenologically rich concepts and how you fit them into when you're sort of like sitting down to write your book, how you work with them when you're trying to answer political questions. Thanks.
Shall I go ahead? Yeah, well, I mean, I don't have a very long answer here because I rely on other people's work who does think much more about these psychological concepts. And so I think, actually, I don't know that I have a good theory of moral sentiments in my account. I just rely on other accounts. And when we were talking about justice and democracy, you're right that there is a sense in which we're all making psychological assumptions about the humans and the limits of human nature, or we're thinking about the nature of cooperation or what kind of conflict. But I don't know that I have a theory of how I incorporate them. So I think I just rely on work that is already out there. And I don't think I do anything particularly earth-shattering or paradigm-changing that it requires me to justify how I'm actually using them. So, yeah. I think I suppose I rely on certain assumptions about human nature that feature in a number of works of political philosophy about, I don't know, scarcity or operating under conditions of moderate altruism or, or about the passions. But I don't know that I have like a specific place in my account for it, yeah.
So I clearly, am I on? No. let me do something about this. Okay, am I now on? Good. All right, good. I think I obviously I'm up to my neck in psychological assumptions because they come in two forms. I mean, one is concerned with what goes on and could go on in actual human discussions aimed at getting as close as we can to the ideal conditions that I specify. So that seems to me to be not so worrying because there are experiments in these things and there are reports on experiments on these things. And there was a wonderful Tanner lecture here last year by Hélène Landemort, who actually gave me some lovely examples of the ways in which it seems that people can transcend and get inside one another's skulls. So I think I'm less worried about that than I am about where the counterfactual stuff comes in. So there's a sense in which the account of how individuals make moral judgments is highly idealized, because I need not only the kind of processes that go on in the discussions to be able to bring people together, I need individuals to be able to imagine how that process would go, to, as it were, round up all the people, or representatives of all those who are affected, and understand their points of view and understand how their points of view might interact with one another. That is probably extremely hard for people. But it has been pursued by a number of people, I think, in the history of thinking about this kind of problem. Not so much by professional philosophers, but I think actually this is a project that Wordsworth undertook in trying to write what Coleridge told him he had to write, namely the first philosophic poem in the language. So what he ended up doing was telling people about how his own sensibilities had developed. And that's really what the prelude and the bits and pieces of the other stuff is all about. And I think that's probably the best we can do, to try to go through a series of exercises that will shape ourselves in ways that make us not only able to discuss with other people and enter into their lives, but also to have the imaginative powers to understand how that might work in various situations. In fact, I think human beings can do this with people they know and love very, very closely. I think we actually already get to do that with respect to our families. We can do it a little bit with people outside our families, very close friends, et cetera, and then it sort of dilutes as we move outward. And it gets very, very hard when you're dealing with a problem on the scale of the public, which is why I want to replace the individual judgment with actual procedures, institutionalize this kind of thing, and develop norms for making it work. I face up to the challenge that this is a highly idealized account, but it needn't be a highly idealized account. It could be something that was part of our democratic society and our practices.
Hello. Hi. Yeah, I'm really intrigued by Dr. Wodak's the pendulum and the analogy between biology and political science. I find that very helpful. And I think one of the ways in which I think another way to respond is maybe to say that even in the biological context, there are cases where a creature is just trying something out and then realize that it doesn't work. So in the case of eyes as serving a function to detect lights, I feel like there are definitely cases where some creatures are just trying different mechanisms to detect light better, and then realize that it doesn't work, so that it reverses back to the original the original mechanism or the original organ. Or sometimes there even maybe regress can be characterized as an overcorrection of that kind of coming back and then realizing the things that doesn't work. So I wonder, how do you feel about that kind of response? And maybe a follow-up question to the original response from Dr. Yippies is that I feel like you were saying that there are cases where things become stabilized. So even if after the progress there's a regress, you don't go always all the way back to what was worse. How does that kind of thing look like? Do we have a criteria to say, okay, this is when a political progress is sufficiently stabilized, as in the case maybe in a biological context where after you develop some kind of organs that no matter how you evolve, there's no way you go back to maybe 10,000 years ago or something like that. Yeah.
So I'm happy to respond, but do you want to respond?
Maybe I'll just say something briefly on this, because I think I want to contemplate the possibility that, because as I said yesterday, progress is not necessary. So if I were to say you can never go back, that would make progress always go forward. It would be a kind of story that is not really, to me, it's not plausible, because you can't make it ends up being deterministic teleology in the end if you say it's always moving in the right direction. So I think it's possible empirically that we can contemplate a stage where everything we know about this idea of justification that somehow we've discovered, that's, democratic, let's say, as opposed to divine right of kings, or as opposed to religious authority or whatever, it may be that there might be a time where, we enter the deep, deep, deep dark ages where there isn't even memory of this other previous democratic era that we might have lived in. So, the erosion of knowledge and education goes so fundamentally down that you kind of go so deep that in the end, there is nothing in which those norms of justice are one way entrenched or another. And here one of the things, a lot of my talk was about political entrenchment, so it was about, the justice system, legal reform, and so on. But I do think that there are ways in which the political survives in culture. So there are ways in which, even if you go back in the legal documents and erase all the kind of previous achievements, there are films, there is literature, there are, there's this kind of way of oral knowledge, oral traditions, so things that survive somehow. Of course, when they also all disappear, so when culture also disappears, then there is really nothing, and then you really are in a kind of periods of regress. But that's where then you enter this paradigm of moral terrorism that I was talking about yesterday, that Kant says, well, we're not there yet somehow. But yeah, you can't rule it out completely. So.
So I feel like this is Leah's show, so I don't want to say too much, but briefly, I think you're absolutely right in asking the question that with both technology and biology, there's trial and error. There's experimentation with technology, and there's a similar thing to experimentation in Darwinian selection and biological traits. What you don't expect to see, though, is trial failure and adoption, right? That's against the selective mechanism. And it's especially difficult to see that being recurring with, like Jim Crow seems to be the adoption of a failure if we want to take it as a form of regress, which I think we should, but we want to recognize that it was quite significantly enacted and enforced for several generations. That looks very hard to square with the thought that we have a teleological account where we're thinking of functions, teleology, the telos, in this kind of what are called etiological terms that is kind of central to Larry Wright's theory of functions, and that Philip adopts, and that I think is actually going on in the background for Leah Yippie's theory. It's the account of functions in terms of what explains why things exist or persist. Because if you're seeing that, performing this function of legitimating the coercive force against the denizens and citizens is what explains why we're doing X, but then it ceased to exist or persist for that reason, then it ceases to be the function. Then we have not functional refinement, but functional change. We have the kind of adoption of a new function rather than a continuation and refinement of an old function. So there's a lot of pressure, I think, within an etiological account to say that when we're not just seeing trial and error, but seeing the adoption of what we would have considered to be a failure in a kind of stable fashion, at least for a generation or two, that's hard to square with this being really a form of functional refinement rather than change.
I see anxious.
I would like to basically combine an answer to the last two questions. So one issue about functional refinement is, look, we're always coming up with new ideals. And so you're never going to have like a fixed point here. And just to take an example, the ideal of companionate marriage, which started in the late 18th century, basically. Now, this has immensely enriched the quality of personal experience within marriage, and also arguably was a very strong basis for the feminist movement. John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, who co-authored The Subjection of Women, made that a major theme. And so, but part of what happens, and I find this incredibly important, so Mill, he succeeded Adam Smith, whose great book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, really deserves to be read and reread. It's chock full, really dense with empirically testable hypotheses, but he wasn't, they didn't have experimental psychology in those days or anything like that, but he was a person, I think, of profound insight into human nature, and Mill actually followed in his footsteps in stressing not just sort of facts and reason and argument. Indeed, he diagnosed the cause of his depression in his youth as to a utilitarian education, which pretty much eliminated any space for moral sentiments in thinking about, the human good. And in fact, it was his reading of romantic poetry and romantic literature that made him realize, okay, we really got to pay attention to these moral sentiments. And that reintroduction of sentiments and a more sensitive psychology for how, what people care about, I think is important for understanding progress. So what are we seeing today? Number one, I think small d Democrats have been making very serious sentimental errors. Okay, we could see this, for instance, the 2016 campaign Hillary Clinton denouncing the opposition as a basket of deplorables. Okay, like that's just frank democratic malpractice, and also just a frank failure to understand the sources of resentment of elites that was powering Trump's campaign. And this is why I think, right, I agree with you, Leah, that we don't have to make any concessions on grounds of facts or accuracy to the diagnoses that MAGA is offering to people. But I think having some grasp of sentimental failures, and in particular failures of empathy, is really important. You can empathize with people and their distress and not just marginalize them as deplorables. You can sympathize with their distress and offer a very different diagnosis of what's really troubling them. But you have to do that not just sort of in purely analytic terms. You got to connect emotionally to people for uptake. And so that's why I think democratic practice requires a better grasp of political psychology, and why I think we can't really avoid engagement with research on irrational motives, which are, a lot of our politics. When you have a significant percentage of evangelicals who think that, the liberals are really just a cabal of pedophiles who are kidnapping children and drinking their blood and raping them, okay, like, this is not in the realm of rational thinking, okay? There's something else going on, and we have to come to terms with that and figure out, how to deal with it. And in this respect, it's not an accident within evangelical circles that now empathy is labeled a sin, okay? That's really important. There's a kind of psychological control going on. If you think that it's even sinful to try to understand other people's perspectives, you're in big trouble from a democratic point of view.
Yeah, so I want to respond to something that Dan said. I actually don't accept the etiological theory of function. I accept something that's sort of the negative image of it. So in other words, I don't focus on the history of the organism or the organism type. That would make function assignments very, very hard indeed, since, when you're talking about the function of, say, a molecule in some part of human physiology, how on earth are you expected to know anything very much about the evolutionary history of that? No, rather I look at, as it were, the selective forces to which the organisms are responding, and the molecules are responding as well. So what I want to look at are what Darwin called the hostile forces of selection, the kinds of ways in which pressure is being put on a population of organisms. And the changes in that are, as it were, the experiments. And that's exactly, it seems to me, like what Leah said, and it's enhanced by what Liz has just said about the ways in which all of these various pressures push things in different directions. So I actually think that if Leah develops the notion in that way, that makes it a reasonable response to your challenge.
On this side
Is this on? Hello. Hi, Përshëndetje dhe shumë faleminderit, Dr. Ipi. So my name is Apostle. So a lot of this went over my head a little bit. I'm actually a student at the dental school. This was really enlightening to hear. I sort of have like a more personal question, or sort of more based off my personal experience. Like, so when I've gone back to Albania and I've like hung out with my grandpa and like gotten coffee, those kind of things, a lot of his like friends or people that we'll meet sort of like really empathize with communism. And like, even if I never met them, like the third thing they'll say to me is like, and I'm a communist, by the way. And I find that like a little odd. Is it sort of, what is like the explanation behind that? Is it sort of like if you were to ask like a slave owner post the abolition of slavery, they're like, oh yeah, I mean, it benefited me. Is that who I'm talking to, or is there like a different reason why you might have supporters of a system that a lot of people would say didn't work?
Well, I mean, I guess there is a difference between the ideal of the system and the implementation of the system, and the ideal of communism is not the same as slavery. And so it seems to me that if you think about communism as the full realm of freedom, as those we were saying earlier, you know, this condition in which human beings' altruism is so developed that you don't even need justice anymore, because that's basically what the withering away of the state is for Marx. You know, communism is a condition. This is why it's not like communist Albania, because in communist Albania, the state is everywhere. And so it's the exact opposite of communism, where you don't have, people are so nice to each other. They don't even need the law anymore. They have internalized the law. They do the right thing all the time. Every talking about psychological motives and inclinations, they are all driving them in an altruistic direction rather than in the other, in the kind of selfish direction and so on. So if people think about that ideal, they will say, yes, of course, I agree with it. What's wrong with it? That's a very nice way of thinking about the future. But I think in Albania, it's actually, and in post-communist societies, it's something different. It's not so much the ideal. It's more that it's very difficult to think about a world in which, on the one hand, you were purely repressed, but on the other hand, you also had agency. So my mother, she was in the dissident movement during communism. And now when she speaks of the years of communism, on the one hand, she says, yes, it was purely repressive. But on the other hand, it was her life for 50 years. And, you know, she got up in the morning, was a teacher, tried very hard to educate children, believed in some things about freedom and justice, and they were also there in the apparatus, in the education apparatus. She did her best with the constraints that she had. So she had agency in her life. And I think the critical position that says to people that come from that background, your entire life was a mess. You're a failure. You lived in this system. You were kind of, how did you live under these oppressive circumstances? Why did you not have all the great things that we have, like civil rights and opposition movements and so on? That's very hard to take, because people did try and they did exercise, they did have agency over their lives. And so when they say that they are nostalgic, what they're really nostalgic is not the party and the bureaucrats telling them what to do. What they're nostalgic is the part of their lives in which they felt that they had agency and where they did their best. And so there is a view of those lives as failures and oppressed lives. But there's another view of it, which is a more optimistic one, which says, yes, there was a lot of constraint, but there was also agency. And I think that's a very reasonable stance, and one that people from that background should actually appropriate and vindicate, rather than being ashamed of it and thinking that there's something problematic about it.
Now it's time for a historian to intervene. Also, this is from my study of the Soviet Union, having lived there both during Soviet times and after. Not only the ideal, but actually what they experienced. They experienced a society in which there was stability, order, safety, and predictability. And then they got a society in which they didn't know about the future, in which all kinds of anxieties of this new capitalist system, in which you didn't really fit in, suddenly became a reality that you had to live through. So they look back, and it is a kind of nostalgia, but it's also a real experience that they went through. And there was development and security and all the rest of it. So don't worry about this old communist.
Thank you so much.
Great. So, Professor Kitcher, you pointed out that until 25,000 years ago, we were, living in small groups, and then sort of trading and larger groups started to form. We had increased resources, maybe increasingly complex sets of rules. At some point, there's the agricultural revolution. We also have increasing disparities of power. And it seems like it's not clear that this is a clear case of moral or political progress. There are things that we may have lost in this transition, like high levels of democratic deliberation that you might find in small groups. And so I was thinking about two questions. Like, one is, are we sometimes at risk of conflating political and moral progress with technological innovation and the emergence of more complex social systems? And the other is, I guess, maybe when we think about justice as something that functions to regulate institutions and power, are we sort of implicitly assuming that we're talking about very large societies with powerful centralized institutions?
I think I want to say yes to both of those. But I would make a caution here. I mean, I began by saying, when we think about progress, it's important to try to focus on transitions among states. And it's important, actually, to decide exactly how we specify those states. And And when we talk about progress, as it were, through the Paleolithic and into the Neolithic, it's just too big. I mean, the states we're talking about are just too big and too complex to do that. I think you're absolutely right to say that when you move from a large group, a small group to a larger group, that may decrease the possibilities for democratic deliberation, unless you take steps to avoid that. I think that's right. So I think there are losses, but I think there are also gains. And the challenge always is to try to figure out the accounting in such a way that you can do something about the losses and preserve the gains. And of course, much of what we see in the lurching of the pendulum that you described, and I think that's a great image, by the way, what we see is people, as it were, being terribly attracted by one sort of gain and then losing lots of other stuff in the process and then fighting to win that back. And I think we have this tendency to think that as it were, progress really only begins in history when we've got to Mesopotamia in roughly 4,000 years ago, and I think that's completely wrong. I mean, I think what we actually saw was an amplification of human responsiveness to one another, regimented partly through people's conversations, regimented partly through incipient structures of authority that enabled all sorts of good things to develop, but that in the process actually sacrificed some things that belong to democratic deliberation that we have to put back today. So thank you very much for the question. Could I say something just in response to your worries about democratic deliberation? Is this a good moment? Like this? So I mean, you're completely right that when you say who are the people who are the representatives who participate in this, and if we're dealing with animals, if we're dealing with terribly developmentally challenged children, if we're dealing with old people who are demented, if we're dealing with future generations, they can't participate. That's exactly right. So what we have to do is we have to represent them by people who stand in for them. And I've said something about this in the case of experimental animals. I wrote a piece on that. And I think there are ways of, as it were, representing them in the conversation without having them represent themselves. Now then, you said the ruler can't measure itself. I'm sorry, Dan. This is an old bug that has gotten into philosophy that has obviously bitten you very badly. You want a foundation for something. Well, sorry. I can't give it. What I can say is we developed this particular form of life. I call it ethical life. It's made us what we are. There's no getting outside that and coming back to justify it. That's the end of the story. If I were Wittgenstein, I would say my spade turns here, right? Justifications come to an end, and they come to an end there. So, I mean, I think that's just it's a quixotic demand.
But that is the foundation. I mean, that is great. That's for me, that's the foundation. So
what is the foundation?
Well, the ethical project. That is now, that's it, right?
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
all we have. We don't need to worry about what there was before it, because we can't think before it. So.
But what worried Dan was that I was now building democratic ideals from the beginning into that. And how can you do that? Well, that's just the way it started. And that's just the way it seems to work best.
Oh, yeah. I would just like to point out that there's really some wonderful work that I draw on in my Dewey lectures that raises, I think, one of the most profound questions about human nature. The work is by Christopher Baum. It's called Hierarchy in the Forest.
Yep.
And he poses this fascinating question, which is, you know, we evolved from primates who were completely hierarchical, like our common ancestor with chimps. We know that basically that humans belong to a despotic species. That is, we have pecking orders, hierarchies. But at the same time, we know that hunter-gatherers are uniformly democratic.
Yep.
Okay, like how did that happen? And Baum actually has a fascinating account of the evolution of human capacities for democratic self-government. And he connects that deeply, by the way, with the origins of morality. So what were the functions of morality? Number one, to basically enable a better conflict resolution between people. But the second one is super interesting. The second feature of morality was to basically keep the sociopaths, bullies, and narcissists from ruling over us. Yeah, well.
He draws on this fabulous diagram, which was constructed by somebody else's name I've forgotten, the so-called U-shaped curve, which shows you, high levels of inequality at the beginning, and then a long period in which there is relatively egalitarian stuff, and then who knows when. This period actually of relative equality seems to go on into the first cities. I mean, the buildings in the first cities are all roughly the same size, and then you start getting differentiation, and some people apparently living in bigger structures than others, and some of these structures being much less well equipped for daily life than others. But that's, probably about 6,000 years ago, you get the second spike.
Actually, I wanted to say something. This is unrelated. It's more about the point that Philip was making about deliberation and scale. Because I wonder if I can make a constructive comment and actually somehow say that it seems to me that the possibilities for democratic deliberation now on the question of scale, well, I have good news. We have capitalism. So if you think about commercial society and the way in which commercial society has expanded globally and brings people closer just by the virtue, the very kind of Adam Smith argument, the virtues of the market, it seems to me wherever there is a smartphone, there is possibility of deliberation because people are already connected. So you already have this very basic feature, which is we can move beyond authority and structures and family and ways of understanding community that are very restricted. And we have now opened up to this world where it's actually possible to transcend some of those bonds, which is why Marx in the Communist Manifesto says the bourgeoisie has battered down all Chinese walls. And then now all you need to do is to think about the politics of that. But yeah,
that's so if communication via cell phone or the internet has the same features that you can get in face-to-face communication. And I think there are reasons to worry about that.
Now, we have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to ask the two questionnaires to give your questions. Then I'm going to turn to the panel, and starting with Liz, we'll go through and everyone will have a chance to reflect on those two questions, okay? I think we're on this side first. Go ahead.
Hello. My name is Spencer Mullins. I'm actually a student coming in next semester, hoping to do an honors thesis. I only say that to illustrate the fact that, that it's a privilege to be here, and I also have no idea what's going on. So I'm just trying to piece together everything I can. But my question is, I more wonder, like the idea of political regression was brought up, ideas of empathy being used as a tool, or even empathy being nowadays painted as a sin or a weapon. My question is more of how do we get people, let's say the voter base or the electorate, the common people who vote, how do we get them to care about political progress, to not be apathetic? Because a fear of mine, at least in the current kind of political environment of America, is that a lot of Americans, they vote on a very simple basis, or that it's just more of whatever is in their intermediate world, of just that they vote with mostly their wallet, that it's not very forward-thinking or very ideological. I was just wondering, how do you contend with that? How do you get people to care about progress if that could, if that kind of aspect to them, this apathy, could be a sign of regression? How do you contend with that?
Hello. There we go, that's working. My question is, so Professor Wodak brought up the concern that there's certain voiceless stakeholders who are unable to participate in ideal deliberation. Professor Kitcher, your response was that we can have other people speak on their behalf. Do you think this is a reliable mechanism for having their voices heard. Yeah, I worry about this because, yeah, a lot of our biggest problems, in my opinion, like the voiceless are often the ones experiencing the most pain. Like there's about an order of magnitude more broiler chickens in the US than there are human beings. Climate change is primarily going to be affecting future humans and non-human animals. So yeah, is this like enough to rely on people who empathize with these people who are often obscured from view, or animals who are obscured from view, and have that be part of the conversation?
Okay, very good questions. We'll start with Liz and go right down the panel and end with Leah.
Okay, on the question of political apathy, I think it's important to understand that the inculcation of apathy through blizzards of lies and bullshit, or as Steve Bannon says, flooding the zone with shit, that is designed to induce confusion and cynicism and basically, oh, it's so complicated, everybody's saying contradictory things, none of it makes sense, so I'm just going to give up on politics. Like that is a serious tactic of authoritarians. And, you know, how do we address that? I think this is why I'm stressing the importance for democratic practice of building a culture of communication, plain speaking, not speaking down to people in highfalutin terms, to explain like what actually democracy can do and deliver for ordinary people, so they could see and feel palpable improvements in the quality of their lives. That I think is really key to dealing with apathy, is enabling people to see democracy actually solve first order problems.
Yeah, I think I will go to the other question, since I think Liz has said some very good things about the apathy question. So, of course, you're right to worry about representation. People can be misrepresented by people who have no interest in them, no understanding of them, no great knowledge of their lives, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, with respect to animals, I think what you need are people who understand things about things like animal pain, animal suffering, standard outside life cycles and patterns of life for the animals in question. I mean, you can't get inside the animal's skull very easily, but what you can do is look at the kinds of ways in which it seems in a benign environment to act, and the kinds of things that it enjoys doing, the kinds of things it shies away from. With respect to the future, you have to pursue a completely different strategy. We don't know anything about these people as people. We can only assume that they will have many of the same needs that we have, and it's actually people who understand the environments in which they are in who will understand the ways in which they're likely to be challenged. So it's precisely the kinds of people who are trying to understand what the world is going to be like if we go up, say, 4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. Those are the people to whom we should turn, because they are the sorts of people who will know what the physiological effects on that is, and they will need to have help from social scientists to translate those into psychological effects and social effects as well. So, I mean, the answer is always going to be, this is much worse than having people speak for themselves, but we can find ways of approaching the problem and, as it were, diminishing it.
Okay, I'll be trying to be very brief on each question. On the first question of how we get people to care more in voting on broadly moral and political progress as opposed to voting with either abstaining or voting in a kind of cynical manner, my own think on this, which is probably only a partial solution or partial diagnosis of the problem, is that much went wrong when democracy scaled up and there was a sense that it was hard for votes to be meaningful. The people who tended to vote most were people who are more like us. They're highly politically engaged, often highly educated. They're elites in all sorts of ways, especially culturally elites. And the more downtrodden individuals tended to feel more alienated from the system, felt more disengaged. And over time, this was rationalized by an understanding of democracy where all that really mattered was that people had power, opportunity, options, not that they actually exercised those options. And it was quite explicit in a lot of democratic literature from the 50s onwards, that it doesn't really matter if the poor and downtrodden don't show up because they still have the option of doing so. And that, I think, is something that a lot of liberal egalitarian democratic thought over the last 70 years is guilty of, is a kind of complacency towards oligarchy where everyone has the option, but the elites are the only ones who exercise it, and in effect, the elites rule over the downtrodden. We have to end that way of thinking about democracy if we want to meaningfully have an expression of the kind of equal status of all citizens under a democratic regime where we take their voices seriously and don't just hope that only the college-educated show up on the special elections to vote for Democrats. That's a way of really pushing back against, I think, the kind of alienation that we see is motivating a lot of the current political shifts we see, especially in this country, but not just in this country, because it's a much broader trend towards authoritarianism globally. On the second question, I guess the thing I'll just say briefly about this is a common line from contractualists and moral philosophy, people like Scanlon. How do we include animals? We have to have kind of trustees, as Scanlon puts it, representing their views. In democratic theory, there's a line for this. It's virtual representation. It's the justification that was offered for why we didn't need to extend the vote to women because their husbands and fathers voted so well on their behalf. And there's a lot of vices of virtual representation, even when it's husbands and fathers voting on behalf of their daughters and wives who they had kind of intimate relationships with and had a better claim to know than E.O. Wilson has a claim to know an aunt. I just think it's much harder to see how the vices of virtual representation are surmountable in the context of humans and non-human animals when they weren't really even surmountable. And the virtual representation has a very checkered democratic status. Even in the case of the disenfranchisement of women before the suffragettes. So I guess it's a challenge, especially if you aren't just trying to offer a contractualist view, but a democratic contractualist view, to explain what makes virtual representation democratic in a context where it looks much worse than the forms of democratic contractualism. Much worse than the forms of virtual representation that we justly rejected in the past on democratic grounds. But it's a challenge. It's not insurmountable, and it's a brief challenge because mainly I wanted to illustrate there's some perils in going in a different direction from the direction that Leah wants to go in the way of developing Leah's own pragmatist project. So that's all
You do the best you can.
Yeah, best I can, and then the final word obviously should go to Leah.
Actually, I wanted to go back to apathy, and because I want to end on a political message rather than on a kind of revival of pragmatism versus realism dispute, and maybe to just actually give first a somewhat different look at apathy, and then end up, as I say, with a more optimistic message, which is the message. So the different account of apathy coming from former communist society is that apathy can be a form of activism when people don't buy propaganda anymore. So my parents just never listened to communist news. They just, when the news were up, they were not politically active in any way. They were very performative, as in a way in which people here might go to vote, but they didn't care. They had no faith in the system, and because they had no faith in the system, there was any kind of political engagement with the system. So their response was apathy. And for me, it was a kind of activism somehow, because it signaled to the elites that, look, we just don't care about you. I don't know what you're saying, but I don't buy any of it. And the kind of activism that the right has mobilized is, to some extent, a way of saying to people, actually, you don't need to be apathetic. You can have a kind of activism that requires, fighting against immigrants, or fighting for making your country great again, or being behind the MAGA project. Or the last protests in the United Kingdom were actually anti-immigrant protests. People went on the streets to fight against, migrant hotels, and why do we need to accommodate, and so on. So that meant that the right had given them a way of thinking about agency that turned their apathy into political engagement. Now, it's a wrong kind of political engagement from our perspective, but it is a kind of political engagement. And I think the only way in which I can look at this whole story, and to end on an optimistic note, in a different light, is to say, it seems to me that now even liberals have understood that the system is broken, that there is really something fundamental that needs to be done, so that any kind of stuff that is being churned out about, like in the greatness of the EU. Everyone understands the EU really needs to be reformed and really needs to change in how it thinks about power and economic versus political issues. once there is this understanding that this is a real crisis of legitimation, it seems to me that, yes, the risk and the downside of that is that the right mobilizes people, but it also opens the path to another way of interpreting crisis and another way of thinking about the political, and also hopefully another response to apathy, which is, well, there can be progressive activism, there can be progressive movement. So I think that's the kind of silver lining maybe of where we are now, and that's maybe also how and why I think that political progress is important, because it gives us the tools to think about and to articulate that, but also to not think about, as we were saying earlier, just the deep, dark, regressive times in which we are, but also in a more hopeful way about the future. So I'll just end.
Well, what a wonderful way to end. In fact, if liberals actually also understand there's a crisis and we have to think about new ways of legitimizing, that's pretty hopeful. These are two extraordinary days, beginning with Leah's lecture yesterday and this fantastic panel, and it's going to leave us with a lot of things to think about. Let's thank them for what they've given us.
Great, thank you.